There is a valley in eastern Tennessee where the land rolls gently, and the hills have the kind of unhurried quality that seems particular to this part of the world. The ridges here are long and parallel, running in quiet succession from northeast to southwest, as though the earth itself once folded slowly and then settled into stillness. Forests cover the higher ground, oak and hickory and cedar, and in the lower places, fields open up between the tree lines, and small roads move quietly through the landscape without any particular urgency. Streams find their way through these valleys, dropping off the ridges and crossing the bottomlands before joining larger rivers that carry the water, eventually toward the Tennessee River and then beyond. If you are settling in for the evening or finding a comfortable position, you are welcome to let this carry you gently through the night. If you enjoy what you hear, a quiet like or subscription helps this channel continue, but there is no rush. We are going somewhere that requires no hurrying. We are going underground. It is the kind of landscape that does not announce itself. You could drive through it on a late afternoon in any season, the light falling across the fields, the tree lines casting long shadows. The sky moving through its ordinary changes, and you might feel only a general sense of quiet of countryside, of a place where things happen slowly and where time does not seem especially rushed. You might not feel any particular curiosity about what lay beneath the surface. Most people never do, but beneath this part of Tennessee, the stone is doing something remarkable. It has been doing it for an enormous length of time, millions of years, and it will continue doing it long after any human presence in this valley has passed completely from memory. The stone beneath the surface here is limestone, and limestone has a quality unlike almost any other rock. It dissolves, not quickly, not in any way you could observe in a human lifetime, but steadily and with a patience that has no equivalent in the human experience of time. Rainwater absorbs a small amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and from the soil, becoming ever so slightly acidic, a mild carbonic acid, nothing dramatic. And when that mildly acidic water meets limestone, something begins. The stone gives way. Slowly at first, and then along paths it has opened for itself, water finds its way downward, widening cracks, following fractures, carving passages through rock that was once the floor of a shallow tropical sea. Beneath the hills of eastern Tennessee, that process has been underway for so long and has worked so thoroughly through the limestone that the stone is riddled with passages, chambers, and underground spaces that most people walking above them have never imagined. And in one particular location, in Meigs County, Tennessee, a place that sits quietly alongside a highway near the small community of Sweetwater, the process created something that required an entirely new category of thinking when people finally understood what it was. Beneath that ordinary ground, there is a lake. Not a small pool, not a flooded passage. A lake, an underground body of water of considerable size and uncertain depth, contained within a cave system that extends far into the limestone. It has been given the name the Lost Sea, and the name suits it, not because it is dramatic, but because it is genuinely accurate. There is something about a body of water hidden beneath the ground, invisible from the surface, beyond sunlight, carrying the cold and silence of geological time, that makes the word lost feel like the right word. Not lost as in missing. Lost as in removed from the familiar world. Lost as in belonging to a different order of existence than the one we normally inhabit. This is the story of that place, how the stone was made, how the water found its way through it. How the cave came to exist, what lives within it, who first entered it, and what we have gradually come to understand about the hidden world beneath one quiet Tennessee valley. To understand what lies beneath the Tennessee hills, it helps to begin with what can be seen from the surface, not because the surface is the whole story, but because it is the door through which the deeper story must first be entered. Eastern Tennessee occupies a particular geological province that geologists call the Ridge and Valley. It is not a single valley, but a series of them, long, linear valleys separated by parallel ridges, all of them oriented in roughly the same direction, all of them created by the same fundamental process. Hundreds of millions of years ago, before any of the landscapes we recognize today had taken shape, this part of the world was a zone of collision. The great plates of the Earth's crust were moving, and where they met, the rock folded and crumpled under enormous pressure, rising into mountains and crumpling into valleys in a slow violence that lasted tens of millions of years. The ridges visible today in eastern Tennessee are the worn remnants of those ancient folds, the harder rocks resisting erosion, the softer rocks giving way, the whole pattern of ridges and valleys reflecting a structural logic that was set in motion before the first forests existed on land. The rock beneath the valleys is largely limestone. It formed earlier still, during a time called the Ordovician period, and continuing through the Silurian and into the Devonian, roughly 400 to 500 million years ago, when this part of North America lay near the equator and was covered by a warm, shallow sea. In that sea, enormous populations of marine organisms lived and died over millions of generations, and their shells and skeletons accumulated on the seafloor in layers that compressed over time into the stone we call limestone. The calcium carbonate of those shells, the same material, is still there in the rock, carried from a vanished ocean floor through 500 million years to become the hills of Tennessee. When you walk across a limestone landscape in eastern Tennessee, you are, in a sense, walking across the compressed remains of an ancient sea. The fossils visible in limestone outcrops along roadsides or stream banks are not decorations. They are the actual creatures of that ancient ocean, corals, crinids, brachiopods, mollusks, preserved in the stone that was once their home. This is not a metaphor. The limestone is made of them, and limestone, as we have already noted, dissolves. But to understand how a cave forms, how the lost sea came to exist, it is worth following the water more carefully, because the story is worth the time it takes to tell. When rain falls across this part of Tennessee, it begins its descent toward the underground almost immediately. The thin soils that cover the limestone absorb the water and pass it downward. The water picks up carbon dioxide from the root systems of plants and from the decomposition of organic matter in the soil, becoming slightly acidic. When it reaches the limestone, it finds the cracks and fractures that exist in the rock, the joints and bedding planes that geological history has left behind, and it enters them. Water moving through limestone does not simply flow passively. It reacts chemically with the stone, dissolving it at the surfaces it touches, widening the fractures it has entered, over time creating pathways that grow from hairline cracks into passages large enough to admit the water in greater volume, which accelerates the dissolution, which widens the passage further. This process, the dissolution of limestone by slightly acidic water, has a name. It is called karstification, and the landscapes it creates are called karst landscapes. The Ridge and Valley province of eastern Tennessee is one of the most extensively karstified landscapes in the United States. Beneath the surface, the limestone is riddled with the evidence of this long chemical conversation between water and rock. Passages, chambers, sinkholes, where the ceiling of an underground space has collapsed springs where underground water emerges at the surface. And rivers that simply vanish into the ground and reappear somewhere else, having traveled through the stone itself. The Sweetwater Valley, where the lost sea is located, sits within this broader landscape. It is a quiet place. The Little Tennessee River drainage and the surrounding valley systems carry water through the region, and beneath the surface, the limestone has been worked by underground water for an extraordinarily long time. The cave system that contains the Lost Sea is not an isolated oddity. It is part of a landscape that, when understood from below rather than above, looks nothing like the gentle farmland and forest visible on the surface. From below, it is a network, a hidden architecture of passages, chambers, and underground water, of which the Lost Sea is the most spectacular known room. The hills do not give any of this away. They simply stand, as they have stood for geological ages, wearing their forests and their fields, offering no visible sign that beneath their foundations, water has been carving a different world entirely. Before following the water deeper into the earth, it is worth pausing for a moment with the limestone itself, because the stone is not merely a background material. It is the protagonist of this story in a sense that no other rock could be. Limestone's solubility sets it apart from most other common rocks. Granite does not dissolve this way. Sandstone does not dissolve this way. Quartzite and gneiss and shale each respond to water differently, and none of them open themselves to water the way limestone does. This peculiar chemistry, this willingness of calcium carbonate to enter into solution when the water is slightly acidic, is the reason that some of the most extraordinary underground environments on Earth exist within limestone and virtually nowhere else. The Lost Sea, Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, the great cave systems of the Appalachians, all of them exist because of this same fundamental chemical property of the stone. But the limestone beneath eastern Tennessee did not begin as a cavern. It began as sediment on the floor of a shallow sea, deposited over millions of years in layers that preserved the record of the ocean environment in which they formed. Different layers contain different fossils, different textures, different chemical compositions, each one a record of a particular moment in geological time, a snapshot of what the sea was doing and what was living in it at the time that layer was deposited. The limestone exposed in cave walls today contains those layers, and if you know how to read them, they are a book of extraordinary age. Over time, the sea withdrew, the land rose, the sediments compacted into rock. And then the long work of erosion began from above while, simultaneously, the long work of dissolution began from below. Rain fell, water entered the ground, and the limestone that had spent hundreds of millions of years solidifying on a seafloor began to open. The cave system beneath Sweetwater Valley reflects this history in its structure. The passages of the cave do not run randomly through the rock. They follow the original bedding planes of the limestone, the boundaries between layers, and they follow the joints and fractures that formed when the rock was stressed by the same geological forces that built and then eroded the Appalachian Mountains. Water is opportunistic. It finds the easiest path, and in limestone, the easiest paths are the ones already opened by the rock's own internal geometry. This means that a cave system is not simply a hole in the ground. It is a record of the rock's history, of the water's history, and of the slow negotiation between the two. Every passage tells a story about which way the water was flowing, at what depth, under what conditions, and for how long. Geologists and cave scientists, speleogeologists, can read those passages the way a historian reads a document, extracting information about past environments, past water levels, past climate conditions from the shapes and minerals and sediments within the stone. The cave that contains the Lost Sea formed over an enormous span of time. The exact timeline is difficult to determine with precision, but the processes that created it were already underway millions of years ago, long before any human being existed anywhere on Earth. When the first early humans were crossing into the Americas at the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,000 years ago, or perhaps somewhat earlier, the cave passages beneath Tennessee were already ancient. The Lost Sea itself, as a body of underground water, had existed in some form for far longer than human memory can reach. This is worth holding in mind as the story continues. The cave was not created for human discovery. It was not waiting. It simply was part of the geological reality of the landscape, part of the hidden architecture of a living Earth, existing in darkness and silence and cold water through an expanse of time that has no easy comparison to anything in human experience. To imagine how the cave system beneath Sweetwater Valley came to exist in its present form, it helps to think about time differently than we usually do. Human history, all of it, from the earliest tool-using ancestors through every civilization that has risen and fallen, occupies an interval of time so brief, measured against geological time, that it barely registers. The pyramids of Egypt are roughly 4,500 years old. The cave passages beneath Tennessee were forming when the ancestors of modern humans were still tens of millions of years in the future. The Mississippi River has changed its course significantly in the past 10,000 years. The cave beneath Sweetwater Valley was already old by then. Geologists sometimes speak of deep time, the recognition that the Earth's history extends so far before the present moment that ordinary human intuitions about time simply stop working. When we say that the limestone beneath eastern Tennessee formed 400 million years ago, that number is technically accurate, but it is almost impossible to feel in any meaningful way. 400 million years. 400 million winters, 400 million summers, 400 million cycles of rainfall and drought, all of them occurring before any creature related to a human being had yet appeared on Earth. And yet the result of all that time is sitting quietly beneath a Tennessee hillside, waiting in the particular darkness that has never been interrupted by sunlight. The water that carved the cave system did not work uniformly. It worked in phases, responding to changes in the surface landscape, to shifts in the regional drainage patterns, to episodes of climate change, and to changes in the local groundwater table. During wetter periods, more water moved through the limestone, and the dissolution proceeded more rapidly. During drier periods, water levels dropped, and passages that had been completely filled with water were partly exposed to air. The presence of air inside cave passages introduces a different chemistry, one that produces the remarkable formations visible in many caves, as dissolved minerals in dripping water are deposited rather than removed. Stalactites, stalagmites, flowstone, cave pearls, cave coral, all of these form when water deposits its dissolved minerals rather than carrying them away, and their presence in a cave tells scientists that the passage was once above the water table and exposed to air. The cave system associated with the Lost Sea contains evidence of multiple phases of formation. Some passages are clearly old drainage channels, places where underground rivers once flowed with considerable force, leaving behind the smoothed and sculpted surfaces that moving water creates in limestone. Other areas show the quieter work of slower water, of seeping and dripping rather than flowing. And the Lost Sea itself represents yet another phase, a place where the relationship between the cave and the regional water table produced not a flowing river, but a standing body of water of considerable extent. Underground lakes of this kind form when the floor of a cave passage or chamber sits at or below the level of the local water table. Water fills the lower portions of the cave to the level of that table, creating a still, dark, contained body of water that has no surface exposure to sunlight or weather. The water in such a lake is not stagnant. It moves slowly through the surrounding limestone, connected to the broader groundwater system, but its surface is still, and its interior is dark, cold, and profoundly quiet. The Lost Sea is connected to this broader groundwater system in ways that scientists are still working to fully understand. Water enters the system from the surface, moves through the limestone by paths that are not always visible or easily traced, and eventually emerges somewhere, at a spring, at a surface stream, or through the cave itself. Dye tracing studies, in which a water-soluble dye is introduced into the cave system and then monitored for its reappearance at surface springs or other outlets, have helped researchers understand some of the connections within the system. But the full picture of how water moves through the limestone beneath this valley remains an area of ongoing scientific interest. What we know from study and observation is that the Lost Sea is not simply a pond in a cave. It is part of a living hydrological system, a system in which water is moving slowly and in the dark, through stone, through passages, through the accumulated geology of hundreds of millions of years. The water that fills the Lost Sea fell as rain, perhaps recently, perhaps years ago, perhaps decades ago, and is now moving invisibly through the underground world that time and chemistry created beneath the Tennessee hills. Let us follow the cave passage downward. The entrance to the cave system at Sweetwater is not dramatic in the way that some cave entrances are, not a great yawning opening in a cliff face, not a vertical shaft dropping suddenly into the earth. It is a more modest entry, as cave entrances in this kind of landscape tend to be. The landscape is not dramatic here, and the opening into the underground world reflects the same understated quality as the countryside above. As you move from the entrance inward and downward, the light from outside fades and then disappears. The transition from light to darkness in a cave is not instantaneous, it is gradual. Beginning at the margins of the cave, where sunlight can still reach at certain angles and at certain times of day, then moving into the twilight zone where light exists but is too faint for most plant life. And then into the deeper darkness where light from the surface simply does not penetrate. In that deeper zone, the darkness is complete, more complete than most people who have spent their lives above ground ever experience. It is a darkness without gradation, without the faint ambient light that persists even on the darkest surface night. Underground, in the parts of a cave far from any entrance, the darkness is absolute. The temperature changes as well. Caves in this part of Tennessee maintain a stable temperature year-round, typically close to the average annual surface temperature of the region, somewhere in the mid-50s Fahrenheit, roughly 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. This temperature stability is one of the most striking things about being in a cave. On the surface, the air moves through its seasonal extremes: hot summers, cold winters, warm springs, cooling autumns, and the cave is untouched by all of it. The air inside holds its temperature with a consistency that feels uncanny to someone accustomed to the rhythms of the surface world. It is cool in summer, feeling colder than it is because the contrast with the warm air outside is sharp. In winter, the cave's constant temperature feels relatively mild, again because of contrast. The air is humid, often very humid, close to saturation. Water moves through the limestone constantly, and moisture in the air reflects the intimate relationship between the stone and the water it carries. In many passages, water drips from the ceiling or runs in thin films along the walls, and the sound of dripping water, irregular, patient, unhurried, becomes one of the persistent sounds of the cave interior. The passages within the cave system associated with the Lost Sea vary considerably in their character. Some are tall and narrow, formed along vertical joints in the limestone, places where the rock cracked and water widened the crack over time into a fissure large enough to walk through. Others are lower and broader, formed along the horizontal bedding planes between layers of limestone. These low, wide passages have a different character than the tall ones. They feel more horizontal, more like a slice through the rock than a vertical opening, and they require a different kind of movement to navigate. In some areas, the passages open into larger chambers where the ceiling rises and the walls pull back, and the space becomes more like an underground room than a tunnel. The scale of such chambers can be difficult to perceive in the limited light of a headlamp or torch. The darkness absorbs the space, makes it hard to judge distances, creates the sense that the chamber is larger than it is, or sometimes smaller. The walls of limestone, when they are close, show the texture of the rock, its layering, its fractures, the smooth surfaces where water has moved across it, the rougher surfaces where dissolution has created irregular features. Sometimes there are formations, the mineral deposits left by dripping water, hanging from the ceiling or rising from the floor, pale and irregular, created by a chemistry of patient accumulation. The sound of the cave is particular. The dripping water creates its rhythms, irregular and overlapping. When the passage narrows, echoes become more pronounced, footsteps return from unexpected directions, voices seem to come from places they did not originate. In larger chambers, sound behaves differently again, dispersing rather than reflecting, making the space feel as large as it sounds, or larger. And underneath all of these sounds in the quieter moments, there is something that can only be described as the sound of the cave itself, the barely audible evidence of the water moving through the stone, of the slow geological processes continuing in the dark, of a place that is not silent even when no human voice is present. This is the world through which any exploration of the lost sea must pass. Not an obstacle, but an environment, one that has its own logic, its own beauty, its own conditions for existence, and its own relationship to time that is entirely different from anything above the ground. The cave walls are not simply walls. They are a record of geological time expressed in stone, and if you know how to read them, they carry more information per square foot than most archives of human history. The limestone layers visible in the cave walls were deposited in a specific order, older layers beneath, younger layers above, and they reflect the changing conditions of the ancient sea in which they formed. Some layers are rich in fossils, others contain fewer, perhaps representing periods when the sea was deeper or its chemistry less hospitable to abundant life. Some layers are more pure limestone, others contain clay or silica that was washed into the sea from distant land areas when rivers were bringing sediment from eroding mountains to the ancient shoreline. Mineralogy of the cave formations adds another layer of information. The stalactites and stalagmites and flowstone that form in caves are composed primarily of calcite, the same mineral as limestone, but they also contain trace elements and isotopes whose ratios can tell scientists about the temperature and moisture conditions at the surface when the formation was growing. This field of research, speleothem paleoclimatology, has produced remarkable insights into past climate conditions using cave formations as natural climate archives. A stalactite can be dated using uranium-thorium methods, and its internal chemistry can reveal temperature and rainfall patterns going back hundreds of thousands of years. Caves are, in this sense, climate libraries, places where the record of past environments has been preserved in the quiet dark, undisturbed by the erosion and weathering that constantly rewrites the record at the surface. The cave system at Sweetwater has not been as extensively studied for its paleoclimate record as some other cave systems have been, and it would be inaccurate to present it as a major center of speleothem climate research. But the principle applies to any limestone cave, and it speaks to the deeper significance of caves as geological features. They are not simply interesting spaces. They are repositories of information about the Earth's past, information that is only accessible because the cave environment is protected from the processes that would otherwise destroy it. The sediments on the cave floor add still more information. Cave sediments, sand, silt, clay, organic material, are deposited by the water that enters the cave and then settles out of suspension. These sediments can contain pollen from surface plants, carried underground by water, that preserves a record of what kinds of plants were growing on the surface above the cave in the past. They can contain the bones of animals that fell into cave openings or were carried in by water, a record of the ancient fauna of the region. And in some caves, they contain evidence of human presence, artifacts, charcoal from fires, remains of food that can tell archaeologists about the people who used the cave in the past. In the cave system at Sweetwater, there is documented evidence of pre-Columbian human presence. We will return to that evidence in due course because it carries its own significance and its own story. But for now, it is worth noting that the cave has been accumulating evidence of many kinds for a very long time, and that the understanding of what the cave contains, what it means, what it records, continues to develop as scientific methods improve and as researchers bring new questions to the site. The limestone, in other words, is not finished being read. Every study adds something. Every new technique reveals something that could not be seen before. The cave beneath Sweetwater Valley is not simply a geological curiosity or a tourist attraction, though it is both of those things. It is also a scientific resource, a place where the Earth's history has been preserved in stone, water, and sediment, waiting to be understood. Before any written record existed, before any map had been drawn of this landscape, before the word Tennessee had any meaning to anyone, people were already moving through the hills and valleys of this part of the world. They had been here for a very long time, long enough that the landscape itself had changed considerably since their ancestors first arrived, the forests shifting in composition as the climate warmed after the last ice age, the rivers adjusting their courses. The plant and animal communities reorganizing themselves across thousands of years of environmental change. The people who lived in this region in the centuries before European contact belonged to distinct cultural traditions that archaeologists have worked to understand through excavation, artifact analysis, and the careful reconstruction of material evidence. The broader region that includes eastern and central Tennessee was at various times and in various ways connected to the large and sophisticated cultural networks of the eastern woodlands, to the Mississippian cultures that built platform mounds and organized complex societies across the southeastern United States, and to earlier traditions that preceded them. The Tennessee River Valley and its tributary systems were corridors of movement and exchange, places where people, ideas, and materials traveled across considerable distances. Whether people living near the Sweetwater Valley entered the cave in ancient times is a question that the archaeological record addresses, at least partially. Evidence of pre-Columbian use of the cave has been documented. Artifacts associated with Cherokee use of the cave have been noted in the historical and archaeological record, and the cave region falls within the broader territory of the Cherokee people in the centuries before European settlement of the area. However, the specific nature and extent of pre-Columbian use of the cave system, whether it was used regularly ceremonially for resource extraction or occasionally, is not fully documented. And it would be inaccurate to construct a detailed narrative of ancient cave use without acknowledging the limits of what the evidence actually demonstrates. What the archaeological record of the eastern woodlands does tell us, more broadly, is that caves were not simply ignored features of the landscape by the people who lived near them. Across the southeast and the broader Karst regions of North America, there is well-documented evidence of human activity in caves extending back thousands of years. People entered caves to extract minerals, ochre, gypsum, and other materials with practical or ceremonial uses. They left behind the physical evidence of their presence, torch marks, footprints preserved in clay, tools, and occasionally objects that suggest deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. In some caves in the southeast, archaeologists have found evidence of activity in passages far from any natural entrance, suggesting that people moved deep into cave systems with artificial light, torches, or similar means, and with a purposeful intent. This broader context of cave use in the ancient southeast does not tell us specifically what happened in the Sweetwater Cave, but it establishes that the idea of people entering caves in this region is not historically surprising. Caves were part of the landscape, and people engaged with the landscape in many ways, practical, spiritual, and in ways we may not fully understand. To assume that a cave as significant as this one went entirely unvisited by people who lived nearby for thousands of years would require evidence of its own, and that evidence is not available. The Cherokee, whose historical presence in this region is well established, have a relationship to the cave landscape of eastern Tennessee that is part of a broader cultural context. The Cherokee people, the Tsalagi, in their own language, were the dominant indigenous nation in this part of the Appalachian region at the time of European contact, and they remained so through the colonial period and into the early American Republic. Until the forced removal of the 1830s that history records as the Trail of Tears. Their territory encompassed the mountains, valleys, and river systems of the region that includes the Sweetwater Valley. Whether the specific cave at Sweetwater held any particular significance within Cherokee cultural traditions is not something that can be stated definitively from the available historical record, and it would be inappropriate to speculate beyond what is documented. What can be said is that the landscape in which this cave exists was a landscape known intimately over many generations by the people who lived in it, people who understood its water, its stone, its forests, and its seasons far more deeply than any brief visitor could. If the cave was a notable feature of that landscape, which it seems reasonable to suppose, then it was a feature within a world that was already fully inhabited and fully known before any European eye ever fell upon it. The forced removal of the Cherokee from their eastern homeland in the late 1830s is one of the defining catastrophes of American history. The communities that had lived in these valleys for generations were displaced, their homes, fields, ceremonial sites, and familiar landscapes left behind, in a removal that caused enormous suffering and death. The land that the Cherokee had known passed into other hands, and the history of the region that followed was written largely without them. The cave at Sweetwater became known to American settlers moving into the region, and its exploration and eventual development as a tourist destination took place within a landscape whose indigenous history was largely not acknowledged by those who came to possess it. Telling the story of the Lost Sea honestly requires holding this history in view, not as an accusation, but as an accurate accounting of where the cave sits within the full sweep of human time in this landscape. The cave is old, the water inside it is old. The people who lived above it were also here for thousands of years before the particular history of American exploration and tourism that gave the cave the name by which it is known today. The 19th century brought dramatic change to the landscape of eastern Tennessee. The removal of the Cherokee population in 1838 opened the region to rapid American settlement, and the farms, towns, roads, and communities that followed transformed what had been a Cherokee homeland into the familiar pattern of Appalachian rural America. The hills and valleys were cleared for agriculture in many places, timber was harvested, small communities grew around mills and crossroads, and the landscape reorganized itself around the patterns and priorities of a new population. In this context, caves were noticed, explored, and sometimes put to use. The mid-19th century in American history was also, not coincidentally, a period of considerable cave exploration. Caves had practical uses. Saltpeter, a component of gunpowder, could be extracted from cave soils, and this made cave exploration economically motivated in a way that it had not previously been. Caves also attracted the interest of travelers, naturalists, and the simply curious. The cave at Mammoth, in Kentucky, had become famous by the early 19th century, and the broader awareness that the Karst regions of the Mid-South contained extraordinary underground environments was well established among educated Americans of the period. The cave system at Sweetwater entered the written historical record in this general era. Like many caves in the region, it was known to local residents before it attracted any wider attention. Local knowledge of cave entrances in karst terrain tends to develop naturally. Sinkholes, springs, cold air emerging from the ground in warm weather, or the sound of water in unexpected places all draw the attention of people familiar with a landscape. Whether the cave entrance at Sweetwater was known to settlers in the area before any formal exploration was undertaken is likely, though the precise documentation of that early local knowledge is limited. What the historical record does indicate is that the cave was known and used during the Civil War period. The cave has a documented association with the saltpeter mining that was common in southern caves during that era. Caves in the southeastern United States were sources of calcium nitrate, a precursor to potassium nitrate, or saltpeter, that could be extracted from the soil of cave floors by leaching it with water. This process had been practiced in American caves for decades before the Civil War, and when the conflict created acute demand for gunpowder on both sides, cave saltpeter became a significant resource. The cave at Sweetwater, like a number of other Tennessee caves, was worked during this period. And the evidence of that activity, the wooden vats, the channels, the disturbed floor sediments, represents a layer of the cave's documented history that connects it to one of the most consequential events in American history. This is also, incidentally, one of the reasons why the archaeology of many southeastern caves is complicated. The saltpeter mining operations of the 18th and 19th centuries disturbed floor sediments significantly, mixing and displacing materials that might otherwise have provided a clear archaeological record of earlier cave use. Where people dug channels, moved earth, and installed wooden infrastructure for saltpeter production, they also inadvertently rearranged the evidence that archaeologists would later have used to understand the cave's earlier history. The saltpeter legacy is visible, real, and historically documented. The archaeological record beneath it is harder to read. After the Civil War, the cave at Sweetwater continued to attract local visitors and curious explorers in the informal, unstructured way that caves in rural areas often do. People entered with torches or lanterns, explored what they could reach, left their marks on the walls in some cases, and carried out stories of what they had seen. This pattern of informal, undirected exploration, driven by curiosity rather than scientific purpose, was common to caves across the American South in the decades after the war, and the cave at Sweetwater was not unusual in this respect. What was unusual was what waited deeper inside, in the passages that local explorers had not fully investigated, along the route that led downward and inward through the limestone, toward the part of the cave that most visitors had not yet reached. There is a particular quality to the passage deeper into any cave system that is worth trying to describe, because it is different from the experience of simply being inside a cave. As you move further from the entrance, the character of the space changes in ways that are subtle at first and then increasingly pronounced. The cave is not a single environment. It is a sequence of environments, each shaped by its distance from the entrance, its relationship to outside air and water, and the particular geological history of that section of the limestone. Near the entrance, the cave breathes, air moves in and out in response to pressure differences caused by temperature changes at the surface, and the temperature and humidity near the entrance shift somewhat with the seasons. Insects and small animals may be present, using the entrance zone for shelter. Plants grow where sunlight penetrates. Further inside, the breathing diminishes. The air becomes more stable, more constant. The humidity rises. The temperature settles into the cave's characteristic stillness. Sounds from outside, wind, rain, birds, the movement of traffic on a distant road, become inaudible. The cave is now the entire environment, and the human senses, deprived of the visual and auditory richness they depend on above ground, sharpen in unfamiliar ways. The smell of the cave becomes more noticeable, a cool, mineral smell, slightly damp, carrying the faint scent of stone and old water. The sound of dripping becomes more distinct because there is less competing sound. The quality of the darkness, when light is extinguished, is something that must be experienced to be fully understood, though it can be approximated. It is the complete absence of light, without the faint ambient glow that persists even on the darkest night above ground. The passages that lead toward the lower portions of the cave system at Sweetwater descend through the limestone in the irregular way that all cave passages do, following the rock's own internal logic widening where the rock was softer or more fractured, narrowing where the dissolution encountered more resistant layers, rising and dropping as the bedding planes and joints that guided the water through the stone shifted direction. Some passages require ducking, others are tall enough to walk upright, some are wide enough for several people to move side by side, others narrow to something that requires turning sideways. This variability in passage character is not accidental. It reflects the geological history of each section, which fracture system guided the water here, whether the primary dissolution was along a bedding plane or a joint, whether a later collapse modified the original passage shape, whether sediment from an underground river was deposited and then partially removed in a later phase of the cave's history. Reading the shape of a cave passage is, for a geologist or cave scientist, a way of reading the history of water movement in the rock, a kind of geological diary written in the shape of emptiness. The route toward the lost sea passes through passages that show this variety. Some areas of the cave are decorated with speleothems, the mineral formations that grow when water deposits its dissolved minerals rather than removing them. These formations develop in the air-filled portions of caves, in the zones above the water table, and their presence indicates that parts of the cave system have, at various times, been above the water table and exposed to air. This is consistent with the understanding that cave systems in karst terrain develop through multiple phases, with water levels rising and falling over geological time as regional drainage patterns change and as the water table itself shifts in response to erosion and climate. The deeper you go in this cave, the older the geology around you becomes in a sense, not because the deeper limestone is necessarily older than the upper limestone, though it may be, but because the lower passages were formed in an earlier phase of the cave's history. When the water table was higher and the dissolution was occurring at this deeper level, upper passages, now dry or nearly dry, may represent an earlier still phase when the water table was higher still. The cave is stratified in time as well as in space, and the journey through it is, in a sense, a journey through geological history as well as through physical space. This is the kind of understanding that makes the passage toward the lost seem more than simply a walk through an interesting rock formation. Every step is a step through accumulated time, through the slow, patient, geological process that created this space over millions of years, and that is still quietly continuing. At some point in the history of human exploration of this cave, someone reached the edge of the underground lake. We do not know exactly when this happened. The historical record of the cave's exploration is not as detailed or as well documented as the exploration history of some other major American cave systems. And the popular stories associated with the cave's discovery must be treated carefully, distinguishing what is documented from what has become legend in the retelling. This is not unusual for American cave history. Many of the famous caves of the Mid-South have associated discovery stories that have been shaped and reshaped by local tradition, tourist narrative, and the natural human tendency to make a good story out of an interesting event. What can be said with confidence is that the underground lake that came to be known as the Lost Sea was documented and made accessible to visitors in the 20th century, and that the process by which it became known, moving from local awareness to formal exploration to public access, followed a pattern common to cave tourism in the American South during that era. The cave was developed as a tourist attraction during the 20th century. In 1965, the site was officially opened to the public as a commercial cave attraction under the name Lost Sea, and the Tennessee landmark has operated as a tourist destination since then. The Guinness Book of World Records at various points recognized it as the largest underground lake in the United States, and the cave became well known within the American cave tourism industry. But the lake itself, the physical body of water in the lower portions of the cave, existed long before any of that. Its size and its character are what make it genuinely remarkable. The surface area of the visible lake has been described as covering approximately 4.5 acres. Though the exact measurement and the full extent of the water body, including portions that extend beneath cave walls and into flooded passages beyond the main visible chamber, are matters that continued scientific investigation has continued to refine and discuss. The lake is not simply a large puddle. It extends into flooded cave passages that have been explored by divers, and the underwater portions of the cave system have revealed that the visible surface of the lake is only part of a larger, partially flooded underground environment. The depth of the lake is another matter that is not precisely established in a way that can be stated as a single definitive number. The visible portions of the lake have been measured, and underwater exploration has revealed additional depth and extent, but the full character of the flooded cave system beyond what has been explored remains an area of ongoing investigation. Cave diving, the exploration of flooded cave passages, is one of the most technically demanding forms of exploration that exists, requiring specialized equipment, extensive training, and a careful approach to an environment that offers no easy exit if something goes wrong. The divers who have explored the underwater portions of the Lost Sea cave system have added considerably to the understanding of its extent, but the full picture of the flooded passages has not been definitively mapped. What is clear, and what makes the Lost Sea genuinely distinctive rather than merely unusual, is the combination of its size, its accessibility, and the geological context in which it exists. Underground lakes are not unheard of in karst terrain. The conditions that produce caves also produce flooded passages and underground water bodies of various kinds. But an underground lake of this scale, in a cave accessible to the general public, in a setting that preserves its geological and hydrological character in a reasonably intact way, is not a common thing. The Lost Sea earned its recognition, even if the popular narratives that have grown up around it sometimes blend documented fact with embellishment. The name itself, the Lost Sea, carries a particular weight. It suggests something separated from the world it belongs to, something that was once connected to a larger whole and has since been cut off, something hidden not by accident but by the long processes of geological time. Whether the name was chosen with all of this in mind is unlikely. Names attached to tourist attractions tend to be chosen for their evocative quality rather than their philosophical precision. But the name works because it captures something true about what the underground lake is. It is a sea that the surface world has forgotten, or rather, and this is perhaps the more accurate way to put it, it is a sea that the surface world never knew. Imagine reaching the edge of the lake for the first time, not in a tour group, not with the benefit of electric lighting installed along the route, but in the older conditions of early exploration. Torchlight only. The passage has brought you here through its varying widths and heights, through its changes in temperature and sound, through the accumulated experience of moving through the dark. And then the passage opens and the floor drops away and the air changes in a way that is immediately perceptible even before you can see what has changed. The smell of open water is there, not the smell of a river or a stream with its organic richness, but something cleaner and simpler, the smell of still, cold water in an enclosed space. Then, as the torchlight reaches further, the surface appears, black and still, and seemingly without edge, the light reflecting back from it, in a way that makes the space above the water look infinite, as though the ceiling has disappeared, and you are looking at a night sky rather than a cave ceiling. The reflection is nearly perfect, because the water is nearly perfectly still. There is no wind here, no wave action, no current visible at the surface. The water holds the reflection of the torchlight and gives it back without distortion. The size of the space is difficult to judge in any kind of artificial light. The walls of the chamber that contains the lake are not always visible from the edge of the water, depending on the brightness and reach of your light source. The lake extends further than the light can reach, and beyond the reach of the light there is only darkness, not the empty darkness of a passage, but the complex darkness of a space with an unknown and unguessable interior. The water continues somewhere. The cave continues beneath the water, but where the boundaries are and how far the water extends is not knowable from the edge with a torch in your hand. This was the experience, in whatever variation the actual circumstances of early exploration created, for the first people who reached this point with any kind of systematic intent to understand what they were seeing. The lake is remarkable not because it is mysterious in any supernatural sense, but because the fact of it is genuinely extraordinary. Water underground, in a space the size of several football fields, completely removed from sunlight, maintained at a constant temperature, connected to the surrounding groundwater in ways that are not visible from the surface. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary thing to encounter. The boats that carry visitors across the lake today, flat-bottomed, quiet, moving slowly across the still surface, approximate something of that original experience, though with the benefit of electric lighting that reveals the scope of the space in a way that no torch could have done. The ceiling above the lake, the walls at various distances from the boat, the floor of the lake visible in the shallower areas near the edge, and the darkness that still exists at the far reaches of the chamber, even with modern lighting. All of these give visitors a version of the experience of confronting a body of water that has no obvious reason to be where it is in the complete dark. At the bottom of a Tennessee hill, the stillness of the water is one of its most remarkable qualities. On the surface, water is rarely this still. Even the calmest lake has some movement, wind, the activity of animals, the temperature differentials that cause slow circulation. Here, protected from all of those surface forces, the water has a stillness that feels geological, as though it has been standing at this depth, in this darkness, without meaningful disturbance for a very long time, which, in some sense, it has. The cold is noticeable at the water's edge. The lake itself and the air above it are cooler than the rest of the cave. The large body of water acts as a heat sink, stabilizing the temperature at a level slightly below even the cave's generally constant temperature. In the warmth of a Tennessee summer, the contrast between the hot air outside and the cool air at the edge of the underground lake is extreme enough that visitors who have come in from the summer heat sometimes find the experience at the lake genuinely striking. The cold is not hostile, but it is immediate and specific, and it emphasizes the difference between the world above and the world below. This is, perhaps, the emotional center of the Lost Sea experience, the moment at the water's edge where the sheer improbability of the place becomes most fully felt. Not a discovered chamber, not a large room with interesting formations, but a lake, a body of water that would not look entirely out of place on the surface, translated completely intact into the underground, removed from sunlight and weather and ordinary geography. Existing in the dark, for what the geological record suggests has been an enormous length of time. What lives in that water is the next part of the story, because the Lost Sea is not simply a geological feature. It is an ecosystem, a strange, limited, adapted ecosystem, but a functioning one, and the life that exists in its waters carries its own remarkable story. The water of the Lost Sea is not empty. This is one of the first things that surprises visitors who have not thought carefully about what an underground lake might contain. The assumption, reasonable enough on the surface, is that a body of water completely removed from sunlight in the cold dark of a limestone cave could not support significant life. Sunlight drives photosynthesis. Photosynthesis drives the food chains that support nearly all life in surface environments, and without sunlight, the logic seems to suggest there should be nothing alive in the water. The assumption is wrong, but it is wrong in interesting ways that reveal something important about the nature of life and its capacity to find a foothold in even the most constrained environments. The organisms that live in underground water systems are called stygobionts, a word derived from the Greek referring to the river Styx, the mythological underground waterway of the ancient world. It is a fitting etymology, though the reality of stygobiotic life is considerably less dramatic than mythology suggests. These are organisms that have adapted over many generations to the specific conditions of the underground environment, the permanent darkness, the stable temperature, the limited food supply, and the chemical conditions of water that has moved through limestone for a long time. They are not monstrous or exotic in the way that creatures of myth tend to be. They are, in most cases, small, pale, and perfectly suited to a world that most surface organisms could not survive in. The Lost Sea contains a population of organisms adapted to its underground environment. Among the most notable and the most visible to visitors are the fish. The cave contains what has been described as a population of large rainbow trout, a detail that often surprises people and that requires some historical and biological explanation. Rainbow trout are not native stygobionts. They are not cave fish in the biological sense. They did not evolve in the cave environment and are not physically adapted to permanent underground life in the way that true cave-adapted species are. The presence of rainbow trout in the Lost Sea is the result of human introduction. At some point in the cave's history as a tourist attraction, trout were introduced into the underground lake, and they have continued to inhabit it since. The fish are fed by staff and by visitors who purchase food for them, a practice that reflects the reality that the natural food supply in the lake, while not entirely absent, is not sufficient to support a population of large fish on its own. This detail that the most immediately visible biological life in the Lost Sea is not a wild cave population, but an introduced, managed one, is worth being clear about, because it distinguishes the Lost Sea's biological story from that of caves, where truly endemic cave-adapted fauna exist. The scientific interest of cave biology lies primarily in the organisms that have evolved specifically for the cave environment, not in introduced surface species adapted to conditions they did not evolve in. True cave-adapted organisms do exist in cave systems across the karst regions of the eastern United States, and in the broader groundwater systems connected to caves like the one at Sweetwater. Cave-adapted invertebrates, small crustaceans, isopods, amphipods, cave beetles, and cave spiders, among others, represent some of the most scientifically interesting organisms associated with karst environments. These creatures typically show the convergent evolution that cave environments tend to produce: reduced or absent eyes. Because eyes are metabolically expensive and useless in complete darkness, reduced or absent pigmentation, because pigment is energetically costly and provides no camouflage benefit, underground elongated antennae and sensory appendages, because in the dark tactile and chemical senses become primary reduced metabolic rates. Because food is scarce and energy must be conserved, and slower reproductive rates, reflecting the stable low-energy nature of the cave environment. The groundwater system, of which the Lost Sea is a part, is connected to the broader aquifer that moves through the limestone of the Sweetwater Valley and the surrounding region. And that broader aquifer system is the true habitat of any genuinely cave-adapted organisms that may be present in the system. Dye tracing studies have shown that the water of the cave is connected to other portions of the regional groundwater. That water entering the cave system is, in one form or another, moving through a larger connected network of underground passages and pore spaces in the limestone. The organisms adapted to this environment may be found not only in the visible passages of the cave, but throughout this broader underground system, in spaces far too small for any human explorer to enter. The ecological community of a cave like the Lost Sea depends, ultimately, on organic material entering from the surface. Without photosynthesis, the cave cannot produce its own food at the base of the food chain, and so everything living in the cave depends directly or indirectly on organic material that originates above ground and finds its way underground, carried by water brought in by animals that move between the surface and cave environments, or deposited in the cave sediments. Bat colonies, where they exist in caves, can be enormously important to cave ecosystems, because bat guano represents a significant input of organic material, a nutrient subsidy from the surface world that supports entire communities of cave organisms. The cave at Sweetwater has been associated with bat populations, as many caves in the region are. Bats use caves extensively as roosting sites, particularly for hibernation and for maternity colonies, and the relationship between bats and caves is one of the most significant ecological connections in North American cave biology. The decline of bat populations across the eastern United States, driven in large part by white nose syndrome, a fungal disease that has devastated hibernating bat species across the continent, has had serious consequences for cave ecosystems as well as for the broader agricultural and ecological systems that depend on bats for insect control. This is a story that extends far beyond the Lost Sea, but it is relevant here because it illustrates how connected cave ecosystems are to the world above them, how changes on the surface ripple downward into the underground, and how the health of the cave environment cannot be separated from the health of the landscape that surrounds it. The Lost Sea is a lake, but the cave system that contains it is, in a geological sense, a drainage system, a network of passages through which water has moved and still moves, following the logic of the water table and the available pathways through the limestone. Understanding the underground hydrology of the Sweetwater cave system requires thinking about water not as something that simply falls from the sky and flows across the surface, but as something that moves through the earth itself, slowly, invisibly, through cracks and passages and pore spaces in the rock, following gravity and pressure gradients through the limestone in ways that are often entirely invisible from the surface. The water table in karst terrain is not a flat, horizontal surface in the way that simple diagrams often suggest. It is irregular, responsive, and three-dimensional, rising after rainfall, dropping during dry periods, varying across the landscape in ways that reflect the underlying structure of the rock. In areas of highly developed karst, like the Sweetwater Valley, the water table may be expressed at the surface in the form of springs, places where the groundwater emerges because the limestone is fully saturated at that level and the water has no choice but to come out. Springs fed by karst aquifers can be highly variable, flowing strongly after rainfall and more slowly in dry periods, because the water travels quickly through the cave passages of the karst system rather than slowly through the pore spaces of a more typical aquifer. The Lost Sea sits at a level within the cave system where the water table is intersected by the cave passages. The lake occupies the lowest accessible portion of the known cave, and its surface represents, approximately, the level of the local water table at this point in the landscape. But the lake is not simply sitting there, static. The water in it is moving slowly but continuously through the surrounding limestone, connected to the broader regional groundwater flow that eventually emerges at springs and streams somewhere in the surrounding landscape. Hydrological studies of the cave have included dye tracing, the introduction of a fluorescent dye into the water of the cave system, and then monitoring of downstream springs and water sources for the appearance of that dye. This technique allows researchers to establish connections between different parts of an underground water system that could not be determined simply by observation. If dye introduced into the cave appears at a specific spring some distance away, it demonstrates that those 2 points are connected by a pathway through the limestone, even if the pathway itself cannot be directly observed or entered. The results of such studies in karst systems in the broader region have repeatedly demonstrated that underground water connections in limestone terrain can be far more extensive and complex than the surface geography suggests. Water that appears to be in one drainage basin at the surface may actually be moving underground toward a completely different surface outlet, following the geometry of the cave passages rather than the topography visible above. This behavior, which contradicts the intuitive assumption that surface topography controls drainage direction, is one of the reasons that karst hydrology is both scientifically fascinating and practically important. Groundwater in karst systems is highly vulnerable to contamination. Because pollutants introduced into sinkholes or cave openings can travel quickly through the cave passages to emerge at springs or wells that may be used for drinking water far from the original point of contamination, and without the natural filtration that porous rock would otherwise provide. The lost sea, as part of a connected karst water system, is not immune to the water quality of the broader landscape. Whatever enters the groundwater system above the cave has the potential to reach the cave's water. This practical reality is one of the reasons that land use in areas underlain by karst limestone requires particular care, not because caves are fragile in some mystical sense, but because the hydrology of karst terrain connects surface activities to underground environments in ways that are not always obvious from the surface, but that are geologically and ecologically real. The character of the underground river in the periods of the cave's history when the water table was lower and more of the passage system was air-filled would have been very different from the still lake visible today. An underground river moves, drips, splashes, and carries sediment. It scours the passage floor and deposits material in the quieter zones downstream. It creates a soundscape very different from the profound stillness of the underground lake. The transition from active underground river to underground lake, from the cave as a drainage conduit to the cave as a contained body of water, reflects a change in the regional water table. And that change is part of the geological history of the Sweetwater Valley over the past tens of thousands of years. No account of the cave at Sweetwater would be complete without attention to the formations that the cave contains, the mineral deposits that have accumulated in its air-filled passages over long periods of time, and that represent some of the cave's most visually striking features. Speleothems, the general scientific term for cave formations, come in a remarkable variety of forms, each shaped by a particular set of conditions, and each representing a record of the water chemistry and environmental conditions that prevailed when it was growing. The most familiar are stalactites, hanging from the ceiling, and stalagmites, rising from the floor, both formed by the slow dripping of water that carries dissolved calcium carbonate in solution, depositing a tiny fraction of that mineral with each drip. The rate of growth is extraordinarily slow by human standards, typically measured in fractions of a millimeter per year, though rates vary with the chemistry of the water and the temperature of the cave. A stalactite 1 meter long may represent tens of thousands of years of growth or more. A large stalagmite may have been accumulating for hundreds of thousands of years. The cave at Sweetwater contains formations in various stages of development in the air-filled passages above the level of the underground lake. Some formations are actively growing. There is still sufficient water movement and mineral-laden dripping to add material. Others appear to be inactive, having stopped growing when the water routing in the cave changed, perhaps thousands of years ago, and are simply present as the record of an earlier phase of formation. Where stalactites and stalagmites grow in alignment above and below, where a drip from a stalactite consistently falls onto the same point on the floor below, they can eventually merge, if given enough time, forming a column that connects ceiling to floor. Columns are among the most dramatic of cave formations, partly because of their visual impact and partly because they represent an unusually long period of consistent dripping. a geological patience that the human mind finds difficult to fully appreciate. Flowstone is another common formation type, thin sheets of deposited calcite that coat the surfaces over which water has flowed, sometimes in thin films rather than discrete drips. Flowstone can cover large areas of cave wall or floor, creating smooth, rippled surfaces that reflect the path the water has taken across the rock. Over long periods, flowstone can accumulate to considerable thickness, preserving within its layers a record of the periods of deposition and any interruptions that occurred during them. Other formations are less familiar but scientifically interesting. Helictites are formations that grow in seemingly arbitrary directions, twisting, branching, ignoring gravity in ways that initially puzzled cave scientists. The current understanding is that helictites form when the water pressure within the calcite itself is sufficient to push the growth in directions that differ from the vertical direction that gravity would otherwise dictate. Cave pearls form when a single drip falls consistently into a small pool, coating a central nucleus with successive layers of calcite, in a process similar to the formation of an oyster pearl, but driven by completely different chemistry. Moonmilk, a soft, white, pasty form of cave mineral deposit, is another formation type found in some caves, and one that has attracted scientific interest because of the microorganisms that may play a role in its formation. The formations of the Sweetwater Cave, like all cave formations, are protected under federal law in the United States. The National Speleothem Protection Act, along with state laws and the policies of the cave's operators, prohibits the removal or damage of cave formations. This protection reflects the recognition that formations are irreplaceable. Once removed or broken, they cannot be restored in any meaningful human time frame because their growth rates are so slow. The formations visible in the cave today represent geological investments of time that exceed the entire span of human civilization on Earth, and their preservation is not simply a matter of aesthetics, but of scientific and historical significance. The word formation, applied to these mineral deposits, carries a meaning that is worth pausing on. A formation is something that has been formed, brought into its present shape, by a process that has acted on it over time. The stalactites and stalagmites of the Sweetwater Cave were not placed there. They grew drip by drip, year by year, century by century, in the dark, with no observer, with no purpose beyond the chemistry of water and mineral and gravity. They are among the most patient structures in the natural world, and they are genuinely ancient by any measure that matters to human history. At some point, curiosity about a cave transforms into something more systematic. The informal exploration, the torchlight ventures, the local knowledge passed between neighbors, the stories told in general terms about how far a person had gone and what they had seen, gives way to an effort to understand the cave completely, to map it, to establish its dimensions and its character with enough precision that the map can be trusted, compared to other maps, used as a basis for further investigation. Cave mapping is an art and a science, and it is harder than it sounds, unlike the surface of the Earth, which can be mapped with reasonable accuracy from above using surveying instruments, satellite data, and aerial photography. A cave can only be mapped from within, a passage by passage, station by station, with measurements of distance, direction, and ceiling height taken at regular intervals, and then combined to construct a picture of the three-dimensional space. The result is a survey, a map of the known cave that shows the plan view, the profile, and ideally the cross-sections at key points, and it represents, in most cases, the work of many individual survey trips over a considerable period of time. The cave system at Sweetwater has been mapped to the extent that is necessary for its operation as a managed public attraction, and portions of the system beyond the public tour route have been surveyed by cave explorers and researchers. The flooded portions of the system, the underwater passages that extend beyond the visible surface of the underground lake, have been explored and partially surveyed by cave divers whose work requires the mapping techniques of cave surveying adapted to an underwater environment where visibility may be limited. Access is difficult and the physical demands of the work are considerable. What surveys of the Lost Sea Cave system have revealed, taken together, is a picture of an underground environment considerably more extensive than what a surface visitor would see on a standard tour. The passages of the cave extend beyond the tour route. The underground lake extends into flooded areas beyond the visible chamber. And the overall system is part of a broader geological context, the heavily karstified limestone of the Sweetwater Valley, in which additional cave development almost certainly exists even if it has not yet been found or entered. The question of how much cave exists beyond what has been mapped is one of the genuinely open questions about this system. Karst cave systems in limestone terrain often contain passages that are too tight for human entry, but that may open into larger spaces beyond. Passages blocked by sediment that could theoretically be dug through flooded passages whose water level might change under different conditions. And passages that simply have not yet been found because the surface opening is hidden or inaccessible. The total extent of the Sweetwater Cave system, including all of its connected passages and flooded areas, is not precisely known, and that uncertainty is not a failure of exploration, but a reflection of the genuine complexity of cave systems in mature karst terrain. Cave exploration in systems like this one is ongoing. The community of cavers, the people who explore caves as a serious avocation with appropriate training and equipment, has contributed enormously to the documentation of cave systems across the United States, often in partnership with scientists and land managers. Their surveys, conducted over many decades, have revealed the extent of cave systems that were only partially understood before systematic survey work was undertaken. Some of the largest and longest cave systems in the United States were initially known only in small portions, their full extent revealed over years and decades of careful exploration and mapping. The Lost Sea sits within this broader context of American cave exploration, a significant and distinctive site, recognized for its underground lake, but also part of a larger story of how humans have gradually come to understand the underground world that exists beneath much of the country's karst terrain. Maps can capture dimensions and spatial relationships. They can record the shape of a passage, the size of a chamber, the direction of a survey leg. What they cannot capture is the quality of the space, the coolness of the air, the smell of old water. The way sound moves differently in different parts of the cave, the quality of the darkness, or the particular sensation of standing at the edge of a large underground lake and looking out over water that has never seen the sun. These things belong to experience rather than to cartography, and they remain, in some sense, unmappable. The story of how a natural wonder becomes a place that ordinary people can visit is rarely a simple one. It involves decisions made by individuals who saw possibility in a landscape, investments of labor and money, the gradual development of infrastructure in places where infrastructure does not naturally exist, and the slow accumulation of a reputation that draws visitors from an ever-widening distance. For the cave at Sweetwater, this process unfolded across the 20th century, and it reflected broader patterns in American tourism and recreation history. patterns that were themselves shaped by changing transportation, rising prosperity, shifting ideas about nature and leisure, and the particular culture of the American South in the decades after the Second World War. The cave at Sweetwater entered its modern phase of development and public access in the mid-20th century. The site was formally opened to the public as the Lost Sea in 1965, giving a name to the underground lake that matched its character, evocative, memorable, and accurate enough to serve as an honest description of what visitors would find at the bottom of the cave. The name carried an implicit promise, something hidden, something removed from ordinary geography, something that required a journey to reach. That promise was not false. The underground lake, encountered at the end of the tour route through the cave passages, genuinely surprised people who had not known what to expect. The development of the cave as a public attraction required significant work. The passages that visitors walk through today were not always as accessible as they appear. Widening of narrow sections, installation of pathways, and steps, electrical lighting throughout the tour route, and the construction of the boats used to take visitors onto the surface of the underground lake. All of these required effort and investment. Carried out in the particular conditions of an underground environment, where every piece of material and every tool must be brought in through the cave entrance, and every person doing the work must navigate the passages that the work itself is intended to make more navigable. The flat-bottomed boats used on the Lost Sea deserve a moment of attention because they represent a particular engineering solution to a specific problem. The underground lake has limited overhead clearance in some portions of the accessible area, and the water, while generally calm, presents the usual challenges of watercraft operation in an enclosed space without wind or current to assist navigation. The boats are electric-powered, which avoids the problems of exhaust fumes in an enclosed underground space that diesel or gasoline engines would create. They move quietly across the surface of the lake, and the stillness of the water means that very little propulsion is needed to maintain forward motion. The effect for visitors on the boat is one of gliding, moving across a surface that offers no resistance, in a space that seems to have no definite edge, with the cave ceiling above and the dark water below. The experience of visiting the Lost Sea as a commercial tourist attraction is necessarily different from the experience of early exploration. The pathways are lit. The route is defined. The cave formations are illuminated by carefully placed lights that reveal their shapes and colors in ways that natural light, which reaches none of these places, never would. The underground lake is reached in a measured and organized way, at the end of a guided tour that provides context and explanation. The wildness of the place has been managed, in the sense that the physical risks and navigational uncertainties of early exploration have been eliminated for the ordinary visitor. This management of the cave experience is, in many ways, a genuine public benefit. It has allowed people who would never have had any contact with the underground world, people with no caving experience, no specialized equipment, no knowledge of cave navigation, to encounter a genuinely extraordinary natural environment. The cave has been visited by hundreds of thousands of people over the decades of its operation as a public attraction, and for many of those visitors, the experience has been their first meaningful encounter with the geological world beneath the Earth's surface. The conversations that begin with a visit to a show cave, the questions asked, the wonder expressed, the curiosity ignited, have an educational value that extends beyond the cave itself. At the same time, the development of any natural site for public access involves trade-offs that cave conservationists have thought carefully about over the years. The installation of lighting, pathways, and electrical systems in a cave changes the cave environment in ways that are not always reversible. Lights support the growth of algae and other photosynthetic organisms on surfaces where no plant life would otherwise exist, a phenomenon called lamp flora, which can alter the chemistry and biology of the cave environment around the lights. The movement of large numbers of people through cave passages changes the humidity and CO2 levels in ways that can affect the growth of formations. The physical infrastructure of a show cave leaves marks on the rock. These are not reasons to keep caves entirely closed to the public, but they are reasons to think carefully about how caves are managed, and they have informed the conservation practices at many American show caves over the decades. The operators of the Lost Sea have worked within the context of evolving cave management standards, and the site has maintained its natural and geological features to a degree that continues to make it a meaningful natural environment rather than simply a constructed attraction. The underground lake remains as it is, large, dark at its edges, cold, still, and genuinely connected to the surrounding geological and hydrological environment. The formations in the air-filled passages continue to be treated as irreplaceable natural features. The broader character of the cave, despite its development for public access, remains substantially that of a living karst environment. In 1974, the Lost Sea was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest underground lake in the United States. This recognition had a significant effect on the cave's public profile. The Guinness Book was, in that era, one of the most widely read reference works in the English-speaking world, and inclusion in it carried a kind of cultural authority that translated directly into tourist interest and media attention. The recognition is worth examining carefully because the category largest underground lake in the United States is not as straightforward as it sounds. What makes an underground lake the largest is its surface area, volume. The total extent of connected flooded passages, including those too tight for human exploration. The answer to that question changes the ranking considerably, and the scientific measurement of underground bodies of water presence challenges that surface lake measurement does not. For the Lost Sea, the primary measurement cited has been surface area, the extent of the visible lake surface that can be measured and observed. By this measure, the claim of being the largest underground lake in the United States has been generally accepted within the cave tourism and caving communities, though it has also been noted that comparisons of underground water bodies are inherently complicated by the difficulty of accessing and measuring all candidates. Cave systems in the United States contain various underground water bodies, some of them well-known and extensively studied, others less so, and the full inventory of significant underground lakes across the country's extensive karst terrain is not something that can be definitively compiled from existing documentation. What the Guinness recognition did, regardless of the precision of the underlying measurement, was establish the Lost Sea as a significant site in American natural history, one worth visiting, one worth learning about, one that represented something genuinely unusual in the landscape of American caves. The public identity of the site has been shaped to a considerable degree by that recognition, and the name Lost Sea itself acquired an additional layer of meaning, not just an evocative description of an underground lake, but a named and recognized place with a specific claim to distinction. The scientific understanding of the Lost Sea has continued to develop beyond what the Guinness listing captured. Research into the cave's hydrology, the extent of its flooded passages, and its relationship to the regional karst system has added considerable depth to the knowledge available about the site. Underwater exploration by trained cave divers has revealed that the visible portion of the lake, the surface that visitors see from the boat, is connected to additional flooded passages that extend the total water body considerably beyond what is visible. The full extent of the flooded cave system connected to the Lost Sea has not been definitively established, and ongoing exploration continues to refine the understanding of what the site contains. This ongoing uncertainty is not a weakness in the site's scientific standing. It is, on the contrary, one of the most interesting things about it, the recognition that a well-visited and well-known site still contains mysteries that modern exploration and science have not fully resolved. The Lost Sea is not a cave where everything is known and catalogued. It is a place where the known and the unknown coexist, where the accessible and the inaccessible share the same geological space, and where the boundaries of human understanding of the underground world are still actively being extended. To truly explore the Lost Sea, not as a tourist attraction, but as a scientific environment, requires a set of skills and approaches that differ considerably from those of surface exploration. Cave science, or speleology, brings together geology, hydrology, biology, chemistry, archaeology, and climatology in the particular context of an underground environment, and the methods used to investigate that environment have developed considerably over the past century. The geological investigation of a cave begins with the rock itself. Mapping the rock types present, identifying the bedding planes and fractures that guided the cave's development, measuring the dip and strike of the limestone layers, and documenting the mineralogy of the formations all contribute to the understanding of how the cave came to be in its present form. This kind of geological work requires time spent in the passages with instruments, making measurements and observations that are then combined with data from surface geology to build a complete picture of the subsurface. Hydrological investigation adds another dimension. Understanding how water moves through the cave system, where it enters, how it flows, where it exits, how quickly it travels, and what it carries with it, requires a combination of direct observation and indirect methods. Water samples taken from various points in the cave can be analyzed for their chemistry, their dissolved mineral content, their isotopic composition, their temperature, and these measurements can reveal information about where the water has been and what it has passed through before reaching the sampling point. Isotopic analysis of cave water can, in some cases, reveal whether the water fell as rain recently or whether it has been moving through the limestone for years or decades. The biological investigation of cave environments has become an increasingly sophisticated field. The organisms that live in caves, the stygobionts of the groundwater and the cave-limited species of the air-filled passages, represent some of the most evolutionarily interesting organisms in North American biology, and their study has contributed to understanding of evolution adaptation and the limits of life in extreme environments. DNA analysis has, in recent decades, transformed the study of cave biology by allowing researchers to identify and characterize organisms that are too small to see or too rare to collect in sufficient numbers for traditional taxonomic study. Water samples from underground lakes and streams can now be analyzed for environmental DNA, the genetic material shed by organisms living in the water, and this analysis can reveal the presence of species that would be nearly impossible to detect by direct observation. Archaeological investigation of caves requires particularly careful work because the conditions that preserve evidence in caves are both an advantage and a complication. Caves preserve organic material well, bone, charcoal, wood, seeds, and other materials that would decay rapidly on the surface, can survive for thousands of years in the stable, cool, low-oxygen environment of a cave interior. But the sediments in which that evidence is embedded are often complex and difficult to interpret, and the disturbance caused by earlier human use of the cave, including the saltpeter mining of the 18th and 19th centuries, can make the archaeological sequence hard to read. When archaeologists excavate cave sediments, they work in thin layers, recording the precise position of every artifact and biological remain before it is removed, so that the spatial relationships between objects, which can reveal how they came to be deposited and what they were associated with, are preserved in the record even after the objects themselves have been removed. This meticulous approach is especially important in caves because the value of cave archaeological evidence lies not just in the objects themselves, but in their context, in where they were found, in what layer, in association with what other materials, at what depth below the current surface. The combination of geological, hydrological, biological, and archaeological investigation produces a picture of a cave that is far richer than any single discipline could achieve alone. The Lost Sea, as a scientifically interesting site within a well-developed karst system in one of the most cave-rich regions of the eastern United States, sits within a broader landscape of cave science that has been advancing steadily for more than a century. The knowledge generated by that broader scientific enterprise provides the context within which the specific features and mysteries of the Sweetwater Cave can be most fully understood. A cave does not exist in isolation from the landscape that surrounds it. The history of the Lost Sea is also the history of the Sweetwater Valley, of Meigs County, of eastern Tennessee, and of the broader patterns of American history that have shaped and reshaped this corner of the country across the past 2 centuries. The Sweetwater Valley is a modest but pleasant piece of Tennessee geography, a place where the ridges of the Ridge and Valley Province create a landscape of long views and sheltered bottoms, where the soil in the valley floors supported agriculture for early settlers, and where the presence of water, surface, streams, springs, and the underground water that the limestone landscape produces in abundance made the valley habitable and productive in ways that drier or harder rock terrain could not match. The community of Sweetwater, from which the valley takes its name, developed as a small town in the typical pattern of 19th century Appalachian settlement, a crossroads that grew around commercial and civic functions, a county seat nearby providing administrative organization, churches and schools and stores, creating the social infrastructure of a rural community. The arrival of the railroad in the 19th century connected Sweetwater and the surrounding valley to the broader networks of commerce and movement that were transforming American life in that era, and the railroad's presence shaped the local economy in ways that the cave at that time was not yet contributing to. Tourism in the American South developed slowly in the late 19th century and more rapidly after the Second World War as rising incomes, automobile ownership, and the expansion of the highway system made leisure travel accessible to a much larger portion of the American population that had previously been able to engage in it. The national system of interstate and defense highways, authorized by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, transformed travel patterns across the country, and the resulting increase in automobile tourism created both opportunities and competition for roadside attractions, scenic sites, and natural wonders that were accessible by car. The Lost Sea sits near U.S. Highway 11, which runs through the Sweetwater Valley in the tradition of the older roads and paths that preceded it, following the valley floor, connecting the communities of eastern Tennessee in the pattern that geography has always suggested. The cave's accessibility by road was an important factor in its development as a tourist attraction, because the visitors who came to see the underground lake were for the most part families traveling by car through the region, people who might stop for a few hours at an interesting roadside attraction while passing through eastern Tennessee on their way to or from somewhere else, or people making the cave itself a specific destination. This pattern of automobile-based tourism shaped the physical development of the site, the parking area, the entrance facilities, the visitor center, the gift shop, in ways that reflect the expectations and habits of mid-20th century American travelers. The cave became part of the informal atlas of American roadside attractions that characterized the tourism landscape of that era, a genre of experience that has been both celebrated and gently mocked by American cultural commentators, but that represented, at its best, genuine encounters with the natural and historical features of the American landscape. The Lost Sea also became a part of Tennessee's broader identity as a state with significant natural attractions, a state where the landscape itself, from the Smoky Mountains in the east to the Mississippi Bluffs in the west, offers an unusually rich variety of geological and ecological environments. Tennessee's cave resources are in fact substantial. The state contains hundreds of documented caves, and the karst terrain of the middle and eastern portions of the state represents one of the most significant cave landscapes in North America. The Lost Sea is the most famous of Tennessee's cave attractions in terms of its underground water feature, but it exists within a regional context that makes Tennessee one of the most geologically interesting states in the eastern United States for anyone interested in the underground world. The relationship between the cave and the local community of Sweetwater has evolved over the decades of its operation as a tourist attraction. A successful cave attraction brings visitors who spend money in the local economy at restaurants, motels, and other businesses, and it provides employment for local residents as guides, maintenance workers, boat operators, and administrative staff. The cave has, in this sense, been an economic feature of the Sweetwater Valley in addition to a natural and geological one, and its continued operation represents a connection between the underground world and the life of the community above it. There is a particular quality to unresolved questions in science, to the places where knowledge ends and genuine uncertainty begins, that differs from simple ignorance. Ignorance is the absence of inquiry. Scientific uncertainty is the presence of inquiry that has not yet reached a complete answer, and it is, in its own way, one of the most intellectually honest positions that science can occupy. The Lost Sea presents a number of genuinely unresolved questions that are not manufactured mysteries or speculative puzzles, but real open problems in the scientific understanding of the site and the geological system in which it exists. The first, and perhaps most fundamental, is the full extent of the cave system. The passages explored and mapped within the Lost Sea cave represent what is accessible to human exploration with current techniques and under current conditions. But the cave system almost certainly extends beyond what has been mapped, into passages too tight for entry, into flooded sections beyond what cave divers have been able to reach, and into portions of the surrounding limestone that have not yet been located from any accessible entry point. Karst cave systems in mature limestone terrain typically contain far more cave than has been formally documented, and the Sweetwater area, sitting within one of the most extensively karstified geological provinces in the eastern United States, is unlikely to be an exception to that general pattern. The movement of water through the system remains only partially traced. Dye tracing studies have established some of the connections between the cave water and surface expressions of the regional groundwater, but the complete picture of how water enters the system, how it moves through it, and where it emerges has not been fully worked out. Given the complexity of karst hydrology in general and the particular geology of the Sweetwater Valley, a complete hydrological understanding of the system would require considerably more tracing work than has been conducted to date. The biological inventory of the cave's groundwater, the full catalogue of organisms living in the water of the Lost Sea and the connected aquifer system, is also incomplete. The stygobiotic organisms of karst groundwater systems are often highly localized, found in one cave or one aquifer, but not in adjacent systems. Having evolved in isolation over long periods, and the full diversity of life in the groundwater beneath the Sweetwater Valley has not been systematically assessed with modern molecular techniques. It is possible that the cave's groundwater contains organisms that have not been formally described or named, a scientifically unremarkable possibility in the context of cave biology, where new stygobiotic species continue to be described regularly from cave systems across the eastern United States. But a reminder that the inventory of life in this underground environment is not yet closed. The paleoclimate record preserved in the cave's formations and sediments has not been extensively analyzed, and the cave likely contains within its speleothems and sediment layers a record of environmental conditions going back thousands or even tens of thousands of years. A record that could contribute to the understanding of climate history in the eastern Tennessee region during and after the last ice age. The extraction and analysis of that record would require careful sampling and isotopic analysis, but the information is there in the stone, waiting for the research questions that would motivate its extraction. The archaeological picture of the cave's human history also remains incomplete. The full extent of pre-Columbian human activity in the cave, when it occurred, what forms it took, and what materials it left behind, has not been comprehensively investigated. And the disturbance caused by 19th-century saltpeter mining complicates, but does not eliminate the possibility of recovering additional archaeological evidence from appropriate contexts within the cave. The cave's history as a place known and used by people before the European period deserves more systematic attention than it has received. These open questions are not deficiencies in the scientific understanding of the Lost Sea. They are the natural condition of a complex natural system that has been studied seriously for a relatively brief period, using methods that continue to improve. Each generation of researchers and explorers who turns its attention to this cave has the potential to contribute something genuinely new to the understanding of what exists in the darkness beneath the Tennessee hills. And that potential is itself one of the most valuable things about the site. On any given afternoon in the Sweetwater Valley, rain may fall. It is the kind of rain common to this part of Tennessee, sometimes gentle and persistent, the kind that settles in for hours and leaves the fields sodden and the creeks running dark, sometimes sharp and brief. A summer storm that moves through quickly and leaves the air clean and smelling of wet earth and ozone. The rain falls on the ridges and the valley floors equally, running off where the slope is steep, soaking into the soil where it is gentler, collecting in the ditches along the roads, and moving toward the small streams that cross the valley. And some of that rain, a proportion that varies with the season, the condition of the soil, and the local topography, soaks into the ground and begins its long passage through the limestone. This connection between the rain that falls today and the water that will eventually reach the Lost Sea is not metaphorical. It is physically real, hydrologically documented, and geologically significant. The water in the underground lake is rain that fell somewhere in the watershed above the cave. That entered the soil and moved downward through the limestone that followed the fractures and passages of the Karst system, and that eventually reached the level of the water table at which the Lost Sea exists. The time it takes for a particular rain event to be expressed in the water level of the cave depends on the distance traveled, the character of the flow paths, and the specific conditions of the system, but the connection is real and measurable. This means that the Lost Sea is, in a practical and not merely poetic sense, a living feature of the Tennessee landscape. It is not separate from the world above it. It is connected to it by water, by chemistry, by the same hydrological cycle that governs all freshwater on the planet. The rain falls, the water moves underground, the cave receives it, and eventually the water emerges again somewhere. At a spring, in a stream, in a well, or in the Tennessee River that collects the drainage of the entire eastern Tennessee landscape and carries it westward toward the Mississippi. Understanding this connection, understanding the cave not as an isolated underground curiosity, but as an active part of the regional landscape's water system, changes the way the cave can be thought about. It is not a museum piece. It is not a preserved artifact from the geological past, sitting inert and unchanging beneath the ground. It is a dynamic environment, responding to rainfall events, to seasonal changes in groundwater level, to long-term changes in land use on the surface above it, and to the chemical conditions of the water that moves through it. It is, in the most literal sense, alive, not biologically alive in all of its parts, but hydrologically and geologically alive, active, responsive, and connected to the world in ways that are ongoing and real. This aliveness is part of what makes the preservation of the cave environment more than simply a matter of protecting an interesting geological feature. The Lost Sea is a node in a water system that matters to the ecology of the surrounding landscape, to the biology of the organisms that depend on it, and to the long-term hydrological health of the Sweetwater Valley. Its preservation serves not only the tourists who come to see the underground lake or the scientists who study its formations and biology, but the broader landscape of which it is an integral part. There is a particular challenge in caring for something that most people will never see. The surface world, the forests, rivers, coastlines, and mountain ranges that environmental conservation has worked to protect over the past century is at least visible. People can stand before a redwood and feel its scale. They can watch a river run and understand, in some direct sensory way, why it matters. The emotional case for protecting a visible landscape is not always easy to make, but the landscape itself can be its own argument. It is there in front of you, making its case through the sheer weight of its presence. The underground world does not have that advantage. Most people who will never visit a cave of any kind will carry no particular feeling for what exists beneath the ground they walk on. The darkness and inaccessibility of cave environments means that they must be advocated for through description, through representation, through the accounts of those who have been underground and understood what they found there. The conservation of caves depends, more than the conservation of most surface environments, on imagination, on the willingness of people who have not seen a thing to nevertheless believe that it deserves protection. This is one of the reasons that show caves developed for public access, where ordinary visitors can enter the underground world without specialized equipment or training, play a role that extends beyond simple tourism. A person who has stood at the edge of the Lost Sea and looked out over still black water in a cave that has existed since before the first human beings walked in North America carries something away that they did not have before. Not necessarily a policy position or a conservation commitment, but an experience, a memory of having been in a world entirely different from the one they normally inhabit, of having encountered the geological reality of the Earth in a form that the surface rarely reveals. That experience is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the most reliable sources of the kind of environmental feeling that eventually, in many people, becomes environmental care. The conservation challenges specific to cave environments are worth understanding in some detail because they differ from those of surface environments in ways that are not always obvious. Light is the first challenge. Natural caves exist in complete darkness, and that darkness is not merely the absence of something pleasant, but the ecological baseline of the cave environment. Introducing light for visitor safety, for the illumination of geological features, introduces the possibility of photosynthetic life in places where none would otherwise exist. Algae and mosses and ferns, given sufficient light and moisture, will colonize the surfaces around cave lights and create green patches in a world that is not equipped to deal with them. Lamp flora, as these unwanted biological colonies are called, can alter the local chemistry of the cave, can obscure or damage geological formations, and can spread beyond their original point of establishment if conditions allow. Managing lamp flora is an ongoing responsibility at show caves, and the design of lighting systems, their intensity, their spectral composition, the duration of their operation, has become a specialized field within cave management aimed at minimizing the impact of artificial light on the cave environment. Carbon dioxide is the second challenge. People breathe, and in breathing, they exhale carbon dioxide. In a well-ventilated surface environment, the CO2 exhaled by a group of people disperses rapidly and has no meaningful environmental effect. In the enclosed environment of a cave, particularly in the deeper and less ventilated portions of a tour route, the accumulated CO2 from many visitors over the course of a day can raise the concentration of the gas in the cave air to levels that affect the chemistry of water dripping through the formations. Higher CO2 levels can reduce the rate of calcite deposition in some circumstances, potentially slowing or altering the growth of the cave formations that are among the cave's most significant features. The monitoring of CO2 levels in show caves and the management of visitor numbers to keep those levels within acceptable ranges is another aspect of the ongoing work of cave conservation. Water quality represents a third challenge that is particular to the Lost Sea because of its underground lake. The water of the cave is connected to the regional groundwater, as we have already established, and anything that enters the groundwater from the surface above the cave has the potential to reach the lake. Agricultural chemicals, road runoff, septic system effluent, and other surface world contaminants can enter karst groundwater systems through sinkholes and cave openings with a directness and speed that would not occur in non-karst terrain. And once such contaminants enter the cave water, their removal is extremely difficult. The protection of the water quality of the Lost Sea is, ultimately, inseparable from the management of the land surface above the cave, a fact that connects the conservation of this underground environment to the much broader question of how land in karst terrain should be used. Physical access to the cave, the simple fact of human beings moving through the passages and chambers, presents its own conservation considerations. The surfaces of cave formations are fragile in ways that are not immediately apparent. The oils from human skin, transferred to a formation by a touch that seems harmless, can alter the surface chemistry of the calcite and permanently change its color and texture. The breaking off of small formations by careless visitors removes material that cannot be restored in any meaningful time frame. The compaction of sediment on cave floors by foot traffic can destroy the archaeological record embedded in those sediments. The management of visitor access through defined pathways, through the consistent communication of no-touch rules, through the maintenance of physical barriers where necessary, is the practical translation of these conservation principles into daily operational reality. The broader context of cave conservation in the United States includes federal and state law, private cave owner programs, and the work of organizations like the National Speleological Society, which has been an important voice for cave protection and responsible caving practice since its founding in 1941. The designation of significant caves within federal lands as protected resources and the work of state geological surveys and state cave protection laws have together created a framework within which the conservation of caves is increasingly recognized as a legitimate and important public responsibility. The Lost Sea, as a privately operated commercial cave, sits within this broader framework while following its own management practices. Its continued operation as both a tourist attraction and a functioning natural environment demonstrates that it is possible, though not always easy, to make a cave accessible to the general public while maintaining the integrity of the natural features that make it worth visiting in the first place. That balance, maintained over decades of operation, is itself a kind of achievement, one that reflects the understanding that a cave treated purely as a commercial resource, without regard for its natural condition, eventually loses the very qualities that give it value. There is something in the human relationship to caves that goes beyond the scientific, beyond the geological, beyond even the historical. It runs deeper than tourism and deeper than conservation. It has to do with the fact that caves are one of the few places in the modern world where the ordinary conditions of human existence are completely suspended, where light, whether the passage of time as measured by sun and sky, and the familiar sounds and smells of the inhabited world all disappear, replaced by something ancient and very different. This suspension of ordinary conditions has affected people in ways that are documented across many cultures and many historical periods. Caves appear in the earliest known human art, the painted chambers of Lascaux and Altamira and Chauvet, where people 30,000 years ago or more carried torches into the underground dark and left images of the animals of their world on the cave walls. In a darkness that was complete once their lights were extinguished. Whatever those paintings meant to the people who made them, and scholars have proposed many interpretations over the past century, they represent a deliberate choice to bring human expression into the underground world, to mark the cave as a place of significance that extended beyond the merely practical. Whether the people of the Tennessee landscape left similar expressions in the cave at Sweetwater is not clearly documented in the available archaeological record. But the broader pattern of human engagement with caves in the eastern woodlands, the documented use of caves for mineral extraction, for shelter, for burial, and in some cases for ceremonial purposes, suggests that the cave environments of the Mid-South were not simply ignored features of the landscape by the people who lived near them. Caves were part of the world, and people engaged with the world in many dimensions. The modern experience of cave visiting, however structured and guided it may be compared to earlier encounters with underground environments, retains something of this deeper engagement. The darkness beyond the reach of the tour lighting is genuinely dark. The cool air is genuinely cool. The water in the underground lake is genuinely still and genuinely cold. The geological time represented by the formations and the passages is genuinely enormous. None of these things are simulations or representations. They are the real conditions of the underground world, encountered directly, and the human response to them tends to have a quality that is different from the response to a museum exhibit or a photograph or a film. The cave is not mediated. It is simply there, in its own ancient character, indifferent to whatever meaning human beings choose to find in it. That indifference is part of what makes caves so quietly powerful as experiences. The natural world generally has this quality. It does not perform for human observers. It does not arrange itself for human convenience. It does not take notice of whether it is admired or ignored. But the underground world has this quality in a more concentrated form. Because its condition, its darkness, its temperature, its geology, its water, has remained so constant for so long and is so completely removed from the rhythms and priorities of human daily life, that standing inside it feels like entering a different kind of time. Not historical time. Not the time of events and people and consequences, but geological time. The time in which mountains rise and are worn away, oceans appear and disappear, continents drift slowly across the face of the earth, and the small, brief, intensely alive human story plays out in the thin, bright margin between rock and sky. The lost sea, in its particular way, offers a concentrated experience of this different time. The underground lake has been there, in the darkness, while centuries of human history played out above it. While Tennessee was Cherokee country, while it was a colonial frontier, while it was a Civil War battleground, while it was a rural agricultural landscape, while it became a tourist destination. Through all of that, the lake sat in its cave, cold and still and dark, receiving the water that filtered down through the limestone, maintaining the temperature that the surrounding rock imposed, supporting its quiet population of adapted organisms, utterly unaffected by the affairs of the world above. There is something clarifying about that. Not consoling, exactly, and not diminishing. The human world and its history are not made less significant by the existence of geological time, but clarifying. The cave puts things in a certain proportion. It reminds the visitor, without any argument or lecture, that the world is older than memory. That the processes shaping the landscape are older than any civilization, and that the underground world, the world of water and limestone and darkness and geological patience, will be continuing its slow work long after the present moment has passed into history and history has passed into geology. Let us return for a moment to the water. The rain falls on the hills of the Sweetwater Valley. It falls on the cedar forests on the ridge tops, and on the oak and hickory on the lower slopes, and on the fields in the valley bottoms, and on the roads and the rooftops, and the parking areas, and the small streams that collect the water and carry it downhill. Some of that water flows across the surface and reaches the streams directly, but some of it, a significant portion in this limestone landscape, soaks into the ground. In the soil, the water moves slowly at first, through the root zone, past the decomposing organic material that gives the soil its chemistry, picking up the carbon dioxide that transforms it very slightly into a solvent. Then it reaches the limestone, and in the limestone, its journey changes character. Through fractures measured in fractions of a millimeter, through passages measured in centimeters, through conduits measured in meters. The water moves downward and laterally following the paths that the limestone's own geometry has laid open. The paths that previous water has widened over thousands and millions of years of the same patient movement. It carries dissolved calcium carbonate from the walls of the passages it travels through. It carries the chemistry of the soil and the surface it has crossed. It carries the record of its own recent history in the ratios of its isotopes and the temperature it has recorded. And eventually, after hours or days or months, depending on the path it has taken and the speed of the flow in that particular season, some portion of that water reaches the lost sea. It arrives not as a visible stream, but as a seep, a drip, a film of moisture on a cave wall that gathers and trickles and eventually finds its way to the lake surface. It arrives with the temperature of the rock it has traveled through, and the chemistry of the limestone it has dissolved, and the faint memory of the rainfall event that started it on its way. At the surface of the lake, it becomes part of the standing body of water, joins the volume that fills this portion of the cave, that reflects the light of the cave's artificial illumination, that carries the weight of everything that has happened to it on its underground journey. The lake receives this water continuously in small amounts from many directions, and it releases water continuously as well through the flooded passages that connect it to other parts of the groundwater system. Through the fractures in the surrounding limestone that allow water to move slowly outward toward the regional springs and streams where the underground journey ends and the surface world begins again. This circulation, from rain to soil to limestone to cave to lake to spring to stream, is the hydrological cycle of the Karst landscape, playing out in a dimension that is mostly invisible but entirely real. The lost sea is not the end of the water's journey. It is a resting place, a long resting place, perhaps in geological terms, but a place that is part of a continuous movement that does not stop. The water that fills the lake today will eventually leave it. The water that fills it tomorrow will come from rain that has not yet fallen. In this sense, the lost sea is both an ancient feature of the landscape and a thoroughly contemporary one. Its geological form is old, the passages carved over millions of years, the chamber holding the lake shaped by processes that began long before the first human footprint was left anywhere on Earth. But its water is recent, relatively speaking rainwater that is moving through the system on a timescale of years or decades, not geological ages. The cave is old, the water is new. And the meeting of those two things, the ancient stone and the recent rain, is what the lost sea at any given moment actually is. Now let the journey reverse itself, from the edge of the underground lake back through the passages. Past the formations on the walls, the stalactites, the flowstone, the mineral deposits of patient centuries, past the places where the passage narrows and the ceiling drops and the walls come close, through the changes in temperature and humidity as the root rises and the entrance comes nearer, through the gradual return of light, first the faintest suggestion of it too dim to read by just enough to make the darkness less than absolute, then the unmistakable glow that means the outside is close, then the full presence of daylight, warm and immediate, and flooding in from the entrance in a way that seems almost physical after the cave's careful dark. And then you are outside again. The contrast is remarkable, even though the landscape you return to is, objectively, an ordinary Tennessee valley. The air is warmer than the cave air, warmer and drier and moving, touched by whatever wind is present, carrying the smell of earth and vegetation and the particular quality of outdoor air that has been absent underground. The light is enormous, not just brighter than the cave's artificial lighting, but qualitatively different, coming from the whole sky rather than from point sources, changing moment by moment as clouds move and the sun follows its arc. The sounds are different too. Birds if it is that kind of day, traffic on the distant road, wind in the trees, sounds that were entirely absent underground, that the cave's stone walls had eliminated so completely that their return feels almost startling. The landscape that surrounds the cave entrance, the hills, the trees, the fields in the valley, the sky above, looks the same as it did before the underground journey. Nothing on the surface has changed. But the experience of standing on the Tennessee ground is different now, because the ground itself is different, not different in its actual composition, but different in the imagination that understands it. Beneath these fields, beneath these roads, beneath these ordinary surfaces, the stone is riddled with passages and chambers and underground water. The limestone is dissolving very slowly, adding to the cave system below. The water is moving through the rock at this moment, carrying its dissolved minerals, following its ancient paths. The underground lake is there, dark and still and cold, receiving the slow drip of water from the ceiling and giving water slowly back to the groundwater system and waiting, in its patient geological way, for whatever comes next. The ordinary Tennessee landscape has not changed. But it has become, for anyone who has been underground, a landscape with a second dimension, a depth that is not visible from the surface, but that is nonetheless real, nonetheless present, nonetheless doing its slow and extraordinary work beneath the familiar surface of the world. In the hills of eastern Tennessee, time moves at different speeds depending on where you stand. On the surface, the seasons move through their familiar rotations, the opening of leaves in spring, the heavy green of summer, the color of autumn, the bare gray of winter. Creeks rise after rain and settle again. Fields are planted and harvested. Roads are repaired and used and repaired again. The small communities of the valley carry on the business of human life with its daily rhythms and seasonal changes and generational transitions. Time here is human time, measured in years and decades, in the spans of individual lives, in the succession of families and communities, and the slow change of local landscapes under human care or neglect. Beneath the surface, time moves differently. The limestone beneath the Sweetwater Valley was laid down 400 million years ago in a sea that no longer exists on a continent that has since moved thousands of miles from its original position. The cave passages that now exist in that limestone began forming millions of years ago, when the regional water table was positioned at a different level than it is today, and when the surface landscape above the cave looked nothing like what we would recognize. The underground lake has existed in some form, perhaps not precisely its current form, but a form connected to the same geological processes and the same hydrological system, for longer than our species has existed anywhere on Earth. The human history of the cave, the Cherokee presence in the surrounding landscape, the saltpeter mining of the 19th century, the informal exploration that preceded formal development, the opening of the cave to public visitors in 1965, the Guinness recognition, the decades of guided tour across the underground lake, the ongoing scientific investigation of its passages and water and formations and biology, all of this fits within the most recent and most superficial layer of the cave's history. Measured against the geological time of the limestone and the dissolution that created the cave, the entire span of human involvement with this site is vanishingly brief. This is not a diminishing thought. It is, if anything, an enlarging one. The fact that human history is brief compared to geological time does not make human history unimportant. It makes it precious, concentrated and vivid and alive in a way that geological processes, for all their power and patience, are not. The people who have stood at the edge of the underground lake and looked out over still water in the dark were fully alive in a way that the limestone is not fully conscious, in a way that the water is not. Fully present to the experience in a way that requires consciousness to be present at all. The cave does not know it is remarkable. Only the people who enter it can know that, and the knowing is not a small thing. What remains? After the geological accounting is complete, and the human history has been traced as carefully as the evidence allows, is something that resists the categories of science and history both, something in the experience of an underground lake at the bottom of a Tennessee hill that belongs to a different order of significance than facts and dates can quite capture. It is the experience of the ancient world made physically present, not in a representation or a reconstruction, but in the actual limestone, the actual water, the actual darkness that has been there in its particular form for longer than the mind can honestly grasp. There is a road that runs through the Sweetwater Valley on a gentle afternoon. It follows the valley floor the way roads in this part of Tennessee tend to do, taking the path of least resistance through the landscape, staying close to the level ground where the agriculture is and where the communities have grown. The ridges rise to the east and west, their tree-covered slopes familiar and unhurried, neither dramatic nor dull, simply present in the way that old landscapes are present, without urgency, without announcement, simply there as they have been for longer than anyone currently alive can remember. If you drive that road without knowing what lies beneath it, you see a pleasant rural landscape, the kind of countryside that exists in many parts of the eastern United States, the kind that does not attract particular attention from people who are accustomed to it. The kind that could easily be passed through without leaving any particular impression. A valley, some hills, a small town, the ordinary geography of a region that has been settled and worked and lived in for 2 centuries of American history. But if you drive that road knowing what lies beneath, knowing that under these fields and these roads and these hills, the limestone has been opened by water over millions of years into a network of passages and chambers. Knowing that at the bottom of that network there is a lake, dark and still and cold and large, a body of water that has existed in the underground dark since before the first human beings crossed into this continent, if you know that. The road through the valley looks different, not more dramatic, not more cinematic, not more worthy of attention in the way that famous landscapes are worthy of attention, but more real, more complete, more fully itself. The valley is not just what you can see from the road. It is also what you cannot see, and the what you cannot see is as genuinely present as the fields and the ridges and the small highway that carries you through. The world is like this everywhere if you know how to look. Beneath every landscape there is geology. And beneath the geology there is more geology, and beneath that more still. The earth going down through layer upon layer of history, each layer recording a different phase of the planet's long story. The whole record stretching back to a beginning so remote that the concept of beginning itself becomes uncertain. The lost sea is simply one place where a portion of that geological depth has been opened, where the underground world has become physically accessible. Where the distance between the ordinary surface of life and the deep time of the earth has been temporarily collapsed into the length of a cave passage. In that sense, the cave at Sweetwater is not merely a local curiosity or a regional tourist attraction or a geological specimen. It is a window, one of the relatively rare places where the ordinary human being can stand in the actual substance of geological time, surrounded by the rock and the water and the darkness that constitute the interior world of the earth, and feel, in however imperfect and abbreviated a way, the scale of the world they inhabit. Outside the cave, the afternoon is doing what afternoons in eastern Tennessee do. The light is shifting toward the west, the shadows lengthening across the valley floor, the temperature dropping by the small degrees that mark the approach of evening. The ridge tops to the east have already lost the direct light, their tree lines showing the first suggestion of the dimmer quality that precedes nightfall. Somewhere in the valley, a creek is running over its stones with the sound that moving water makes in shallow limestone terrain, irregular, musical, carrying the cold of the groundwater that feeds it. Below the valley floor, the limestone is doing what limestone in karst terrain always does, receiving the water that finds its way through the soil, dissolving at its fractured surfaces by the small but patient force of carbonic acid, adding to the passages that have been widening for millions of years. Maintaining the underground lake at its ancient level, preserving in its formations the chemical record of centuries of rainfall and climate, and the slow chemistry of water moving through stone. None of this will stop when the visitors leave for the day. None of it will pause when the cave's electric lights are switched off and the underground passages return to their natural darkness. None of it will be altered by the arrival of night or the departure of summer or the turning of another year. The geological process will continue at its own pace, governed by its own logic, indifferent to the calendar and the clock and the particular concerns of the human world that exists, briefly and vividly, on the surface above. This is the patience of stone. Not a conscious patience, the limestone does not wait, does not endure, does not experience the passage of time in any way that resembles the human experience of waiting. But the effect is the same as patience, the consistent, uninterrupted, unhurried continuation of a process that operates on a timescale entirely different from the human scale, and that produces, over that enormous timescale, results that the human scale can barely comprehend. The lost sea is one of those results. A room in the limestone, a lake in the dark, a body of water that has been there, in one form or another, since before memory began. It will be there long after the last person who visited it today has passed from the world. It will be there, probably, long after the particular civilization that built the roads and the parking areas and the visitor center and the flat-bottomed electric boats has passed into the kind of history that archaeologists study in future centuries. It will be there, the stone, the water. The darkness, the slow drip from the ceiling, the still surface of the lake reflecting whatever light is present. As long as the limestone holds, as long as the water moves. As long as the geological processes that created it continue to maintain the conditions in which it can exist. In the very long run, even the cave will change. The water table may shift. The passages may fill with sediment. The ceiling of the chamber may eventually fail, opening the lake to the surface in a different way. The surface itself may erode downward until it reaches the level of the cave, converting underground passages into open valleys. Geological time is long enough that even limestone caves do not last forever. But on any timescale that matters to us, any timescale that includes our children and our children's children and the generations that follow them through whatever changes the world brings, the lost sea will be there, dark and cold and still, receiving rain. Carrying the water through the limestone, preserving in its stone and its sediment the record of an earth that is so much older than any human memory that the comparison almost loses meaning. The evening deepens over the Sweetwater Valley. The last light is leaving the western sky, pulling the warmth of color out of the clouds and leaving behind a particular shade of blue that exists only in the brief interval between sunset and night. That transitional blue that feels neither day nor night, but something in between. Something that belongs to its own brief moment before the darkness completes itself and the stars appear. The cave below is unaware of any of this. It does not have evenings. It does not have the particular blue of the sky after sunset. It does not have stars, or the sound of evening insects beginning, or the cooling of the air that the surface world experiences as the earth turns away from the sun. It has only its own conditions, the constant temperature, the humidity, the darkness, the slow drip of water, the still surface of the underground lake, the patience of stone that does not distinguish between the night above and the day above, because neither one reaches it. And yet the cave is connected to that evening sky, connected by the water that will eventually fall from those clouds, connected by the geology that links the surface landscape to the underground passages, connected by the hydrological cycle that makes the cave and the valley and the sky part of the same continuous system. The rain that will fall on the valley in the coming days will find its way, in part, to the cave below. The water will move through the limestone, joining the water already there, contributing to the lake that has been receiving water in this way for millions of years. The connection is real even when it is invisible. The cave is dark but not separate. It is underground but not isolated. It is ancient but not finished. It is hidden but not lost, or if lost, lost only in the sense of being removed from ordinary sight, existing in a world that most of us pass over every day without knowing it is there. Carrying its geological history and its underground water and its slow chemistry through the same days and nights and seasons that we experience on the surface above. There is something restful in that thought, in the idea that beneath the familiar landscape, the earth is doing its patient and ancient work without interruption or anxiety. The water is moving through the limestone. The formations are growing at their imperceptible rate. The underground lake is receiving the rain. The cave is simply being what it has always been, a room in the stone, a lake in the dark, a piece of the earth's interior made accessible by the long, quiet, extraordinary work of water and time. If you are lying somewhere comfortable now, and the evening is settling around you, and the world outside is doing the ordinary things that the world does at the end of a day, let the image of the underground lake rest in your mind. Not dramatically, not urgently, but quietly, the way the lake itself is quiet, the still water, the cave ceiling above it, too high to see clearly in the available light, the cool air, the faint sound of dripping somewhere in the passages behind you. The darkness that extends in all directions beyond the reach of whatever light you carry. The lost sea has been there for longer than any human story. It will be there long after the story of our particular moment has become the kind of ancient history that future generations will puzzle over. It does not require our attention to continue. It does not need our admiration to be extraordinary. It simply is part of the deep and patient earth, doing the work of stone and water and time in the dark beneath the Tennessee hills. Let the thought of it settle. The water moves through the limestone. The cave holds its temperature in the dark. The lake is still. The rain will fall again on the Sweetwater Valley, and some of it will find its way underground, and the cave will receive it, as it always has, in the patient way of ancient stone. The hills of Tennessee hold their quiet shapes against the darkening sky, and beneath them, in the limestone, in the passages, in the still water of the underground lake that has been there since before memory, the world continues. Slowly, darkly, beautifully, and without end.